I'm Shannon Watkins with the James G. Martin Center for Academic Renewal. I am here today with Anna Miller and Scott Yenor. Anna is the Education Policy Director at the Idaho Freedom Foundation, and Scott is a professor of political science at Boise State University and a Washington Fellow of the Claremont Institute Center for the American Way of Life. Anna and Scott recently authored an upcoming report for the Martin Center that focuses on critical social justice in the UNC system and its enrollment or use of DEI. Scott and Anna, thank you so much for speaking with me today. I really appreciate it.
Thank you for having us.
All right, so to get started, your new report, as I just mentioned, is about critical social justice in the UNC system. But in public debate, critical theory and its derivatives have been hard to pin down. Can you give me your working definition of critical social justice?
Yeah, so thanks for having us, Shannon. The way I look at critical social justice is, it's one way, it's an umbrella term that captures many of the various methods or understandings of identity politics. We hear terms that are like this include critical race theory, gender studies, queer theory, identity politics, multiculturalism. All of them really fall under the same umbrella. And the umbrella is that the dominant culture of the United States is somehow oppressive against a minority group. And the dominant culture needs to be deconstructed or delegitimized. And a new kind of justice needs to be made on behalf of the formerly oppressed. And the formerly oppressed will then experience what is called social justice. So we use the term critical social justice as an umbrella term so that we cover race, gender, sexual orientation, immigrant status. All of that is covered under this critical theory. And it captures both the attitude that the theory has toward the dominant culture, it's critical, and also what the aim of this particular ideology is. The aim is what is called social justice. So a lot of these other things kind of fit underneath critical social justice. So one of the things that's really big in our report is this emphasis on universities for diversity, equity, inclusion. We call it DEI. DEI is part of social justice. DEI is the solution to the dominant culture's, dominance in the culture. How's that? DEI helps us dismantle the dominant culture, and it also points the way to a new, as it's called, welcoming or inclusive culture. So DEI is a policy that helps deal with the problems of critical social justice. And, I know that critical race theory is really one of the hip ways of talking about this. But really, we prefer critical social justice because critical race theory ignores gender. It ignores sexual orientation. And so it really doesn't capture the full scope of how critical social justice ideologies manifest themselves in any of our public institutions. So it's not just about race, it's about gender and these other things. So that's why we've gone with critical social justice as a way of looking at it. But DEI is the policy that delivers on the promise of critical social justice.
Excellent, thank you. Great definition. Tell me about your research. What did you look for, and what are some interesting findings?
Well, I'll start on the first question, and Anna can maybe get in on some of our more interesting findings. So what we have learned is that universities are very proud of what they're doing in these areas, and they make public statements about what their goals are when it comes to achieving critical social justice ideology on their campuses. And now we're going to talk about DEI. DEI is what they're promising to deliver. And so what we have done is looked at all the schools in the University of North Carolina system to see how much hiring they have done, how many people are hired to accomplish their DEI missions. We've tried to find their job descriptions. Here's what they're about doing. We've tried to look at what policies are being adopted when it comes to hiring or student life or other aspects of the university's mission to discover where DEI is really infiltrating the operations of the school. How much is it in the curriculum? And we've looked at that on each of the public universities in North Carolina, tried to show what the public documents reveal. You could do a much deeper study if all the professors were required to post their syllabi, or if all of them were required to post their vitas. We could do an even deeper study. But we've really focused in on the administrative structure, curriculum, student life, and policies to see how far they reflect the DEI ambitions, because all of that stuff is publicly available in their catalogs and on their websites.
Great, thank you. Anna, would you like to add?
Yeah, I can add some detail to that. So our reports are about measuring critical social justice on a campus. To what extent is every layer of the university advancing diversity, equity, inclusion, rather than the pursuit of knowledge or excellence or reward for hard work or meritocracy and things like that? So to do this, we have to look at every layer of the university and to see what they are prioritizing. So, one thing that we found, to get more specific, is every university has diversity, equity, inclusion written into their mission statements and written into their strategic plans with really specific objectives for how to achieve diversity, equity, inclusion. And that could be things like affirmative action. It could be things like hiring more DEI administrators to enforce the status quo on campus. It could be creating sort of different types of DEI policies, like mandatory implicit bias training, or creating new offices dedicated to exclusively minority inclusion, like offices exclusively for women or offices exclusively for LGBTQ people. It could be transforming curriculum. So there's a lot of different types of priorities that universities will set surrounding DEI in their strategic plans. So like some examples of things we found is that every university has some type of implicit bias training that is either mandatory or required for search committees, or at least strongly encouraged. Implicit bias training will often, again, manifest in search committees, and that's a way to make sure that you're only bringing in new members to the university that assent to the prevailing status quo. Universities will also offer like a whole gamut of diversity, equity, and inclusion trainings that are mandatory or strongly required. Sometimes they're even mandatory for students and not just for faculty members. And those are things like safe zone training, or LGBTQ trainings, or anti-racism trainings, a whole array of different types of trainings that are required. And this is to basically put the DEI mentality into members of the university. So again, that no one will dissent from the sort of prevailing status quo. In curriculum, we found that every university has some type of requirement in their general education that prioritizes DEI. So no student can graduate without taking a required course centralizing diversity in their education. Additionally, every university has offices dedicated to some type of minority inclusion, again, like whether it's a gender equity center or an office for LGBTQ individuals and their allies. And we also found that this ideology penetrates residence life. So even where students are living and sleeping, they cannot escape this sort of ideological pressure. So universities have something called living learning communities. And living learning communities are basically large portions of housing that have been diverted away from just the idea that this is a safe place for students to live and sleep and have community, and towards advancement of social justice advocacy. So these housing units usually target freshmen, usually a little bit nicer housing units than other units on campus. And so that's kind of how they lure students in, but they're all dedicated to specific social justice themes, whether that's LGBTQ individuals and their allies, whether it's anti-racism, whether it's exclusively for Black males, or environmentalism, or some other type of social justice cause. And these living learning communities that students join, again, typically as freshmen, have tons of programming that go with them. So they might be required to take specific classes surrounding social justice or DEI. They might be required to go to specific events in programming or networking events. They might be given a mentor to sort of make sure that this mentality grows in them over the years. And so every single layer of the university is adopting this focus of DEI rather than the pursuit of knowledge and things like that, and excellence, those types of things. And that's really their priority. And so that's what our reports measure.
Great summary. Thank you. I want to follow up on this, what you mentioned about student life. Is most of your findings, or a lot of what you found, has nothing to do with the academic side of the university, has to do with this sort of student life, student affairs aspect. Is that correct?
Yeah, a lot of what we found does have to do with like what students' daily lives are going to be like. So, you know, a particular course, like it's not about, like in general education, a lot of their courses have things called service learning requirements. And that's not going out just to get an internship to advance knowledge or grow or something. That's going to go work for a particular political cause, typically, again, surrounding social justice. But, you know, we did find a lot of things at the university level, the administration level. For example, there's massive amounts of spending at the university and the dean level on DEI administrators. You know, like UNC Chapel Hill, NC State are spending over $3 million on those officers.
Well, I was just about to ask also about, this seems to be a lucrative business for some people. Can you state again what those numbers were for UNC and for NC State?
Yeah, so UNC and NC State are spending over $3 million each. I believe NC State is spending around $3.3 million just on DEI administrators, and UNC Chapel Hill is spending around $3.1 million. Another thing to note is that this isn't just in like university level administration for various sort of DEI offices. It's also for things like the med school. For example, UNC Chapel Hill has 8 diversity, equity, inclusion officers dedicated just to its med school. East Carolina University also has more DEI officers dedicated to its med school than they do to their overall university. So it's actually intruding into many STEM fields. It's not just, you know, liberal arts departments or just the university level. It's many STEM fields at the universities as well.
Wow. Well, so this raises a question. This is obviously pervasive in the UNC system, this ideology. Would either of you consider this a top-down or a bottom-up phenomenon?
Yeah, I think it's both an up-down, top-down, and a bottom-up phenomenon. When we looked at the flagship, the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill, you know, the building out of multiculturalism and DEI infrastructure has been going on there for decades. And the same thing you can say about the other top institutions in the North Carolina system. NC State and North Carolina are kind of in competition to be the number one in this way. And so they've been doing it, and it wasn't really pushed over much at the North Carolina system level. There was a strategic plan put together, I think in 2016, by the old head of the North Carolina system, and it really didn't have any DEI ambitions in it. It was really about reaching out to those who have less opportunity in a very race-neutral, gender-neutral way, finding the people who need more opportunity and giving them more opportunities. It was supposed to be a system for all North Carolinians. And it was very much I would say, neutral on these things. But then in 2020, the North Carolina system, put together a task force, and it blessed a task force. And the task force delivered a report. This was in December 2020. And then it became very much a top-down episode. They made several recommendations that were supposed to set a clear path for addressing race and equity issues across the whole North Carolina system. They explicitly framed things in race and gender issues, which hadn't been done before in the North Carolina system, as far as we could tell. And there was a demand in this report, and I'm looking for the name of the report here. higher expectations, I think was
Mhm.
Margaret Spelling's strategic plan. And this new report was, I think, just a racial task force. And I think that was the name of it, anti-racism task force. And, they put together 5 recommendations about increasing the diversity and equity staffing across all of the universities, increasing and representation and retention of minorities specifically at all levels of the university. They were going to increase the number of trainings that were offered. Diversity, equity, inclusion, education was emphasized. More programs in support of racial equity and inclusion. And then what we saw when we looked at it is this stuff was beginning to trickle into every university in the North Carolina system. There were some cases I'm just looking at some now, Elizabeth State, Winston-Salem State, North Carolina A&T, where there was very little by way of DEI programming before 2020. But after these reports came out, everyone began to hire DEI administrators and to change their policies. So I would say the universities that see themselves at the leading edge of social evolution, the top-notch universities, Chapel Hill, NC State, East Carolina, Wilmington, all of those universities had been building up DEI infrastructure before 2020. But the bottom half, if you want to think of it like that, of the UNC system, it kind of lagged behind. And so it's bottom up on the top half and top down on the bottom half, if I can use a lot of different directions when it comes to how this happened. The leadership really mattered. The leadership at the system level really mattered. Because it set a tone for all these universities. It didn't stop universities, but it also didn't require universities to get on board.
Thank you. Yeah, that was great analysis. A large portion of the report consists of university scorecards, which we've touched a bit on. Can you walk me through one of those? How about UNC Chapel Hill, since it's the flagship?
Yeah, I can walk you through UNC Chapel Hill. So what it starts with at the very beginning is a timeline. So UNC Chapel Hill is the only actually scorecard in our report that has a timeline, but this is important because it's important to see how a big university like UNC Chapel Hill has been advancing this for, over or around a decade. So we have a timeline beginning in 2002 all the way up to 2021 for how they started to build their DEI apparatus and divert university resources towards that and student tuition and things like that. And then we go into, for each university, specifically the DEI objectives in their strategic plan. So we give you examples of like their strong, not all of their DEI objectives, but their sort of strongest ones that are sort of leading the university. How are they going to transform the university towards exclusively advancing DEI goals? And then we walk readers through the various administrators for DEI that universities have hired for specific offices. So we'll start with universities always have offices for diversity and inclusion. And we count those different officers and we put their salaries in there. So you can see that so many of these administrators are making over 6 figures. There's so much resources going in there. Some of them are making more than professors on staff at these universities. And then we explain any university committees that might exist at the university. So these committees are kind of how the DEI apparatus begins to grow. So a more built out university like Chapel Hill might have less committees because they already have so many offices and so many administrators. Whereas a smaller university that hasn't advanced DEI as much, they'll start out with committees. So one example is NC State. So they have tons of diversity, equity, inclusion officers, but their STEM fields are not dominated by DEI yet. And so all of their STEM fields, Department of Biology, Veterinary Sciences, they have all these DEI committees, and the committees will make recommendations like you need to hire DEI officers. You need to put DEI in your department's strategic plan. You need to put it in your mission statement so that the department's resources will all be redirected towards DEI. So UC Chapel Hill doesn't have as many committees because they already have all these administrators, but you'll see lots of listed committees for other universities, and that's how the apparatus grows. Then we go into various colleges at these universities. So like we show you all of the DEI officers for the schools of medicine, for the School of Pharmacy at Chapel Hill, for the School of Global Health and the School of Nursing, and all of these other different colleges and schools at the university. And then we show specifically the offices dedicated to minority inclusion and how many more administrative positions are dedicated to those. So things like the Women's Center, the Black Student Movement, the Multicultural Health Program that serves specifically Black, Indigenous, and students of color. And all of the officers dedicated to those. And again, they typically all have very high salaries. And then we give you a number for how much total spending just on DEI administrators are at a university. So for UNC Chapel Hill, it's about 3.1 million. And that's, again, that's just for administrators. So universities are spending way more money on that, on various things like programming, events on campus, just keeping up the offices, and, you know, tons of other things that are kind of initiatives that are stemming from these offices. So this is just a number calculating their salaries, not their benefits or anything else. So the spending is really much higher, but this is sort of a beginning understanding for readers for how much universities are spending on this, rather than spending on things that advance knowledge and excellence and research at the university, which is what universities are supposed to be doing. That's their core mission. And then we walk readers through the policies at each university that are advancing these DEI goals. So that can be, again, things like affirmative action goals. It can be things like implicit bias training that are mandatory. And then we go into the student life aspect. So we talk about general education requirements. So UNC Chapel Hill, they have at least 3 credit hours in their general education that all students have to take, that are explicitly redirected towards understanding of diversity, the new understanding of diversity, the modern understanding, not the traditional understanding of sort of American diversity, but this social justice understanding. And then we go into residence life, and we explain how large sectors of residence life have been diverted towards this cause. And that's things like living learning communities that I was talking about before. And it's also things like events. So universities have decidedly one-sided events hosted all across campus. So they can be things like, you know, whiteness and urban planning, anti-racism and allyship, different titles like that, obviously promoting a very particular political cause, and they don't conversely have events advancing any type of conservative cause like free markets or anything like that. You won't really find events on college campuses advertising free speech debates for like public policy issues or anything like that. They're very much decidedly one-sided. So it's just another example of how students can't really escape this ideological pressure on campus life. And so that's where our scorecards end, is at events. But we try to walk you through every layer of what's happening at the university.
Yeah, and one thing I think that's interesting about that, Shannon, is that we think what we're doing is very conservative, in the sense that we are understating the extent to which DEI is present on campus. Mm-hmm. We're always understating it. When it comes to the budget, we're giving you the lowest possible number. We're acting as if the departments themselves don't promote DEI, right. Because, you know, it's difficult to get underneath precisely what's going on in any particular department. Mm-hmm. So, you know, I think a more complete picture of how present the DEI ideology is on campus would definitely require us to look at what the sociology department is actually teaching, what the psychology departments are actually teaching. And we would show, I think, under those circumstances, that many departments are very hegemonic in the way that they teach, in the kind of views that they have represented in those departments. So, you know, the scorecard is basically the easiest things for us to identify at the universities. Administrative structure, offices, policies, which are actually kind of difficult to get to, curriculum, and events. But if we actually looked, and we've done this in other reports that we have done, if we actually looked at what's going on in departments, it would paint a much broader, deeper picture of how far DEI has infiltrated and really controlled large swaths of our schools. You know, and just to say one other thing, you know, that Anna mentioned before about the medical schools having big time DEI administration. One of the patterns that developed over the UNC system as a whole is that the more professional the college or academic unit was, the more emphasis is placed on DEI administrators, precisely because those are the targets that they have to kind of compromise in order to infiltrate the entire university. So engineering schools and medical schools, to use those as prominent examples, have big time emphasis on DEI in the administration, precisely to address the problem
Mhm.
that they are too professional in their emphasis. They emphasize meritocracy too much, and therefore they need to be overseen more than the English department and the schools of arts and sciences, because those departments are already really infused with DEI and are already kind of doing all of it on their own. So, so that means that the next 10 years of the DEI plan is really going to be to target the more professional aspects of the universities for DEI training and DEI policies.
Oh, well, thank you. That is definitely troubling, but thank you for your observation. So then that leads to my next question. What can be done? What can be done to remove the practice of critical social justice in our universities, while at the same time still respecting professors' academic freedom?
I think one piece of low-hanging fruit that would be a great place to start is simply banning diversity statements in job applications. So right now, one of the ways that universities maintain sort of ideological conformity in everyone that comes in is for these full-time tenure track positions, or even for administrative positions, they'll require applicants to submit a diversity statement. So it's like, state how in 1 page to 2 pages, how your research and work at this university will advance the university's diversity, equity, and inclusion goals, or state your commitment to diversity, equity, and inclusion, something like that. And they do this to make sure that any faculty members they bring in are truly dedicated to DEI, again, not to the original purpose of the university, but now to this new vision, this new transformative vision of what the university should be. So simply banning DEI statements and instead requiring sort of a diversity, intellectual diversity statement, say like you need to state, how your research is going to advance intellectual diversity, or state your commitment to intellectual diversity. I think that would be a really simple first step to take.
Yeah, other recommendations that I think are important is it's very difficult for a legislature to micromanage universities. And if universities want to go in this direction, it's going to be really hard to stop universities from going in that direction. One way to get universities' attention is to hit their budgets. But I don't think it's easy to micromanage their budgets. So I would say that one of the levers that legislatures have is kind of a blunt object, which is to cut the budget of universities by the amount that they are spending on DEI. And I think what we have in our report is, as I say, a very conservative number on what is being spent on DEI. Another way that I think, to go along with the banning DEI statement, Anna and I have these inside arguments with one another all the time. I'm not as in favor of banning DEI as I am in favor of promoting free inquiry and intellectual diversity. I would require every candidate, every job posting, to require candidates to submit a free inquiry, open inquiry, and intellectual diversity statement in their packet. And I would require that every search committee not only have a representative from the DEI task force to oversee what's going on to make sure no one's naughty, but also have someone representing free speech and intellectual diversity. Someone who can do someone whose job it is to look at a department, to survey its intellectual diversity, so that that person can speak on behalf of the needs for intellectual diversity in a department. My guess is this person would have to come from outside the university, because no one cares about it on the university. And but having representatives on search committees that actually stand for the open inquiry, the free speech, the intellectual diversity element that is so important to the scientific method and the scientific project would be another thing that legislatures could require. Another element, and we've done this here in Idaho, but I don't think it's had the kind of effect that we'd like, because we have a kind of lame attorney general here, is that we've passed the civil rights bill that doesn't allow for discrimination on the basis of race, sex, gender, and other elements. And And, then to have those laws actually enforced against the university, that would be something. I saw a little study yesterday on MIT where there's ongoing problems and controversies. And they have fully 18 scholarship programs that are only targeted to either women or a variety of minority groups that men or majority groups, whites, aren't allowed to apply to. Those are all civil rights violations. Right now, if that happens and the state doesn't have a civil rights initiative, the only place you can go for the protection of your rights is the Office of Civil Rights at the national level. If you pass civil rights legislation at the state level, you now have an opportunity to go to Attorney General. And it would be even better if there's a private source of action, cause of action in such laws, so that individual citizens who believe that they haven't really been given a fair shot at scholarship programs sponsored by the state or at state universities could actually try to vindicate their rights in courts. So I think a civil rights initiative is another element. And then the last thing that I would say is transparency. I think having a requirement that every professor posts his or her vita online twice a year, the beginning of January, the beginning of June, and a comprehensive account of their vita. And also all of the syllabi should be posted online. This would allow citizens to know what is going on in the individual departments. This would allow legislators to know what is going on in individual departments. And maybe there are some departments that are so taken with the social justice ideology or one particular ideology that they actually can no longer be said to be objective departments that deserve the public's support. And but that can only be known, and maybe all of them are good. It's possible. Everything's possible, I suppose. I'll take the under on all of them being good, I suppose. But only if there's transparency on vitas and syllabi can legislators and citizens really get a grasp of what's going on in individual departments. Our report doesn't get into that because we can't get into it because of the lack of transparency. So those would be some other recommendations that I think Anna and I, for the most part, agree on being solutions. And then I think one of the last things about this is that the process whereby people become members of the Board of Governors and the North Carolina system has to be revisited. If it's a go along, get along kind of Board of Governors, then it needs to be looked into. And more care needs to be taken in overseeing what the system is imposing on the colleges and universities in North Carolina.
Excellent. Thank you. Thank you both. Thank you very much for all the work that you've done on this report, shedding much needed light on this very serious issue. And I look forward to seeing the report in print in the coming weeks. Thank you.